Gravity Falls is a show that is intensely interested in questions of upbringing, in questions of ancestry, in questions of how the influences of the past are still felt, for better and often for worse, by the present. And yet, there is a large void in that discussion, and that is the parents of Dipper and Mabel. Surely, who their parents are must have had a significant impact on them, must have shaped them in many subtle and not so subtle ways, and yet we don't know a lot about them. We hardly know anything about them, actually. We know deeply about Stan and Ford. We know about their parents and how the harsh, cruel expectations of their father and the flippant carelessness of their mother shaped them in different ways and drove a wedge between them. Seuss has his abuela. Gideon has his much beleaguered parents. Pacifica is tormented by her brutal authoritarian parents, despite genuinely at least wanting to do what's right and gradually gaining more courage throughout the show. And yet there's not a lot about Dipper and Mabel's parents. I do not want to be incredibly Freudian about this and say that every element of someone's character can be traced in a latent, secretive way to their parents and their dissatisfaction with their parents and the tensions of their relationships with their parents. But these are important questions. And Gravity Falls is intensely interested in those questions, and yet, in the case of Dipper and Mabel, there's just a void. I've always been curious about that. Now, the choice to not talk about their parents is likely a deliberate one. That's not the focus of the show. The show is focusing on different things, on different relationships, on different influences on Dipper and Mabel. And talking about the parents would simply complicate that in ways that are not entirely necessary or helpful. The question of origins is an interesting one. Michel Foucault, quoting Nietzsche, argues that this search for origins is a hopeless one, that the idea that there is one single event or one single environment that shapes someone forever and forever, and that sets a course for them in life, is reductive. People, like countries, like civilizations, like cultures, are constantly in the process of change. There is not this fixed essence of them that is transported throughout time, that is stamped in the early stages of existence and continues unabated. Rather, someone is constantly in the process of change. They're constantly in the process of interaction and reconsideration. People are not tied to their past, and the attempt to look for a guiding center in the past is inevitably thus going to be a vacuous one. People are always going to be in this process of fluctuating, in the process of changing, of being transformed by the choices they make in response to their environment and the subtle influences that environment has on them. And that environment can constantly change. So they would say, correctly I think, that trying to locate everything in someone's parentage, or even in the environment in which someone is raised, is reductive, because there is a kind of determinism to it. Kind of belief that there is some core quality of a person that is stamped and made concretely in the early days of their lives, and that people are innately connected to, which they would say is not empirically, historically valid, and it also blocks off the opportunity for people to keep changing and keep constantly transforming, which happens whether people like it or not. It is constantly a process innate to being in the world. People are not tied to this fixed essence that they once were. And yet, it's also wrong to think that these questions don't matter at all. Dipper and Mabel are people who have that capacity for futurity. They are people who shape their own choices and their own destinies. They have distinct personalities, but they choose how they interact in the world. They are not overshadowed by these overbearing parental influences like Pacifica, or to a lesser extent, the older Pines twins, who are constantly trying to compensate and adjust their actions in regards to the parental influences that they dealt with in their youth. Dipper and Mabel have much more of a demonstrated capacity for choosing their own fates. When they diverge in their paths in Dipper and Mabel versus the future, and that causes so much tension, it is not because of very intense parental pressures like the case for Stan and Ford, where Ford deeply desired to go to this fancy school, so does his parents for simple financial utilitarian reasons. He didn't get in. He suspects because of his brother, and that tears them apart, and Stan is thrown out. Their parents are not the only cause of the split between them, but they were a major cause. Dipper and Mabel, conversely, choose different paths because of their own personalities and their own interests. They are ultimately in control of their own fate. Dipper is tired of being a kid. He wants to grow up. He wants to have these mature adventures. He wants to be a true explorer, treated like a respectable, reasonable adult. Whereas Mabel still thinks childhood and adolescence are worth clinging to. They're worth caring about. They're not awkward passages of life merely to be sped through like a fast forward function on an old videotape. They have different values, and that causes the divergence between them. And yet, it's not like their parents aren't influencing them. It's not like they aren't shaped to a certain degree by their upbringing, because everyone is, at least to one extent. It's important to not be deterministic about it, at least in most cases. And there are some cases where parental influence is much, much stronger, as the show demonstrates, but it's always subtle, it's always there. We know that Dipper and Mabel's parents are kind of computer-y people from information that we've gotten from the creators. We know that they seem to be kind of STEM related in their fields. Certainly their father is. Also, they're Californians. It's not the strangest supposition in the world that they're involved in the tech sphere to some extent. But we don't really know a lot about them in that regard. We found out a little bit more in the Book of Bill, released pretty recently, wherein Dipper is shown to be having nightmares. He thinks about fights that his parents have had, and apparently they had a pretty significant fight not long before Dipper and Mabel came to Gravity Falls, and it's implied that that maybe had some influence on why Dipper and Mabel were sent away for the summer in the first place, because tensions were quite heated at home. There's no guarantee of that. It is just implied a little. And remember that this is material released significantly after the fact in Gravity Falls, significantly after the end of the show. But it is worth considering nonetheless that their home life perhaps was not perfect. It was not terrible. I do not think this is a situation like what we had with Amphibia, which still irks me a bit because the implication of the show significantly is that Marcy in Amphibia had a pretty terrible home life, or at least one she thought was deeply uncomfortable, to the extent that she was willing to run away from home and live in a fantasy world and not want to come back. And yet at the end she goes back to home anyway, and that's portrayed as a perfectly fine and normal solution. That always has seemed a bit strange to me. There's no hint of that here. Their home life wasn't terrible. It just might have been a bit troubled. It is interesting that they don't really seem to talk about their parents much, Dipper and Mabel. Again, that just might be a deliberate emphasis for the show. When I took creative writing classes, there were similar emphases that people talked about, that, okay, if you don't want to talk about, say, a parent or an ex-girlfriend or a lost friend or whomever, then don't bring them up. Because once you bring them up and start talking about them, you start inviting all these questions. So if you don't want people to wonder about that, don't bring it up. And I think this show might be operating on similar principles. Dipper and Mabel's parents are not really part of the show. They're not important to what the show is talking about, so the show doesn't bring them up. And that's fine. That's perfectly normal and legitimate. But at the same time, it is kind of weird that they don't really talk about their parents, isn't it? These are kids. They are away from home. They're away from home for the entire summer. I'm not saying kids have to be constantly thinking about their parents or talking about their parents, but the fact that they don't really seem to mention them at all, I think there are a few mentions scattered throughout the show, seems a bit weird. It's perfectly fine to be excited to be away for the summer, especially in such a weird and exciting place as Gravity Falls, with all these fascinating little secrets. But at the same time, they don't really seem to have any homesickness. They don't seem to have any deep desire to return back. They don't seem to have any moments like that. I've always thought that's a bit odd. So, Dipper and Mabel's parents seem to be a big blank in the show. It's not a mystery in the sense that the journals are a mystery, or Bill Cipher is a mystery, or everything that happened to Ford is kind of a mystery. It's a different kind of mystery, one that kind of lingers on the outskirts of the show, that's always there, and one can question it, but that the show never deals with, and never seems to want to deal with, which is particularly odd in a show like this that is so deeply concerned with questions of parents and children, with questions of upbringing, with questions of parental influence and parental pressure. So I will just go keep on wondering about Dipper and Mabel's parents. And I suggest you think about that too, the next time you watch the show. They are kind of an invisible presence. Their absence, I think, is felt quite deeply, even if the show never talks about it. It's always there. It's always lingering. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this one before anyone else. Keep watching Gravity Falls. Tell me, what do you think about Dipper and Mabel's parents? What kinds of people do you think they are? These can just be wild guesses, because the show really does not give us a lot of information. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.